Welcome back to the Morning Grind. Dean here. Dean once again filling in for Stevie. Stevie is still on duty with his NASCAR. If you guys want to hit up the NASCAR packages, you know where to find that on the RotoGrinders site. Stevie will take care of y'all throughout the week. A lot of sports going on. We've been having on various DFS personalities. Of course, you guys can check those out in the archives, not just on the podcast page, but actually on YouTube as well, the RotoGrinders YouTube page. We talked to Head Chopper, Andy Means, Beer Makers fan, Grant Neefer, Ricky Sanders. Had a lot of good conversations, had some good times because, hey, not a lot of sports going down. That said, we're actually going to talk sports. There is MMA this weekend. With that, we're going to bring in Joe Suntzu. You know him as Suntzu on Twitter. He's the Art of War. Joe, you're coming to us from New Jersey. So not only that, we can get to not just some MMA DFS takes, we're going to get some betting takes as well. Joe, how are things in your world?
Absolutely. Look, I could complain, but there are many people that have it worse than I do. So I am happy to be on here. I will have a bet, at least one bet for your followers, as well as some DraftKings info.
Yeah, and Joe, for what it's worth, not just an everyday guy we found off the Twitter machine. He's currently the 8th ranked MMA player as of right now, according to the RotoGrinders ranking. So this is somebody you're going to want to listen to for sure. Monster contest, once again, going down. I believe it's $200K as far as the big contest on FanDuel for MMA. We're going to focus mainly on DK. DK has a $600,000 contest there. You were telling me pre-show, I believe you're going to be firing 150 lineups in this bad boy?
Yeah, when there's 150,000 to first place, I'm going to fire 150 lineups. I do expect with an 11-fight slate that there will be some ties, but this is a good way to get warmed up for the first ever MMA Millie Maker on June 6th. $1 million to first place on June 6th.
Is there anybody big headlining that just yet, or it's just because DFS players have nothing to do? We all want to play.
There's a championship fight with Amanda Nunes, who is a dual belt holder. She holds the belt, the women's belt at 135 and 145. So she is defending her 145 belt against the Phenom, Felicia Spencer, who is a good wrestler, but is a big underdog.
All right. I imagine we're going to have you back next week to talk about that. I hope so.
I hope so. I'd love to.
Hopefully we can get you next week to talk about that with the Million Maker. This week, $600K. That's not too shabby as well. I believe it's 150 at the top, 150K on DK. Do want to ask, and it's important to note, we're recording this on a Wednesday. This will go up on Thursday. It's certainly possible things will change. I know things have changed MMA-wise. We get scratches sometimes, and the first one is we already know at this point. You were telling me this pre-show as well. Looks like Holland is out. He's not going to be fighting.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is a similar situation to what we had on the last slate, where we had the favorite fall out and a replacement fighter step up on short notice. And unfortunately, and I'll tell you why I'm saying unfortunately, DraftKings is following the same process where they're essentially allowing the fighter that remains to stay at their same salary, which on the last slate essentially made Giga Chikadze, who was the fighter who was left against the newcomer, be almost a free square in terms of having high ownership and, at his price point, which did result in quite a few ties because he was on the optimal, or as we like to refer to it in MMA, the nuts lineup. Now, what we have here is, Dean, we have a fighter stepping up to fight Daniel Rodriguez, and this fighter's name is Gabriel Green. I would be cautious in using Daniel Rodriguez as a free square, like many people did for Chikadze. And the reason for that is, Daniel Rodriguez, for those hardcore MMA fans, was essentially brought in to lose to Tim Means in Albuquerque. Big underdog, 33-year-old journeyman fighter. Surprise, surprise, he beats Tim Means. Actually ends up finishing Tim Means. So now he's in a position of being a minus 335 favorite coming up against this gentleman by the name of Gabriel Green. Now, Gabriel Green hasn't fought in 2 years. He's fighting up a weight class. He is local to California, which means he doesn't have a great trip to Vegas. Doesn't train at a well-known camp. Fighting a weight class up. However, when he was fighting, he had a 6-fight winning streak against pretty decent fighters in Bellator, which is a somewhat junior promotion to UFC, but not not a really regional promotion. It's a national, worldwide promotion. So again, if he comes back after this 2-year layoff and he's in shape, and he fights to his potential, I would not feel so confident in counting Rodriguez in at that free square like you did last time.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the salaries. Rodriguez is the third cheapest guy on DK, and I would assume, I full disclosure, but it's not obvious, I am not an MMA savant. I'm just asking questions, and feel free to correct me if I make something, a wrong assumption. But I was looking at the odds when it was Rodriguez versus the dude that got scratched, Holland, and Holland, it seemed like was a favorite. So now he's jumped to from a big dog to a big favorite. And typically you wouldn't have a guy that's minus 335 as the fourth cheapest guy on the board. So ownership is going to flock to him. Are you suggesting that he's an interesting fade when it comes to tournaments?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would preach caution here. Chikadze was a different kind of fighter. I mean, Chikadze had several UFC fights under his belt. He had several wins under his belt. Yes, he was an underdog going into his last fight, but he's not a Daniel Rodriguez type of fighter. I mean, again, Daniel Rodriguez was essentially brought in, and this is all part of the narrative that I find so near and dear, was essentially brought in as a guy to lose to Means in his home state of New Mexico. And it just didn't happen as often occurs in MMA. So all your line value players, you hit the nail on the head, Dean, all your line value players are going to flock to Daniel Rodriguez and say, wow, I've got a minus 335 fighter at 7.3K on DraftKings. I mean, this is equivocal to if you play basketball and you got a guy at minimum salary at 3K and you find out he's starting. Like everybody just rushes to put that guy in their lineup, right? This is very similar. But I would say that Green is not the same type of fighter that Rivera is, who was brought in on short notice to fight Chikadze. So I don't see this as quite the free square. I'm not saying you shouldn't have ownership. I'm just saying be cautious, and it might be worthwhile to be under ownership, whatever that is to this guy. Yeah,
and as far as that, are you more of a Ricky Bobby style, like all or nothing when you're making your 150 lineups, or how ambitious are you? How much do you embrace or go against the idea of variance when you're making your MMA lineups?
I embrace variance. So what I should say is, look, if you're playing 20 lineups, I could see the value in having a really tight core. And there are 20 entry contests in all sports, including MMA. And the way that I do it is I waterfall. 150 entries. I want exposure to every fighter on the card. Even if it's only 1 or 2%, I just want to cover myself. As I start to drill down like to 20, I'm going to have a much tighter core, and I'm going to have an even tighter core on a 3 max. And then I will usually play 1 or 2 cash lineups. So I do embrace the variance because honestly, that's how you differentiate yourself, especially if you are GPP oriented. If you're playing cash, then, you probably don't want to embrace the variance. You're looking for a modicum of safety in how you set your lineups up. But yes, I do embrace the variance in mass entry.
This might be a goofy question. How, if at all, has the lack of a crowd affected how the fights have gone down? And there's been a couple of events so far. Is there anything to that, or it's just, is there any takeaways on that?
Yeah, it's actually a really good question, Dean. And we touched upon this last week on a show that Brett and I did on Brett Apley and I did on Sirius. It allows the fighters to actually hear the instructions from their corners. Where if there's a crowd, it's very hard. And you often hear the corners yelling and screaming in the background to try to be heard. Now, based on the opinion of some announcers, Daniel Cormier in particular, that is not always an advantage because, you are screaming things at the fighter to execute. And he's got this in his head while he's trying to fight. And Daniel Cormier was very critical of Anthony Smith, who was brutalized by Glover Teixeira in a fight that probably should have been stopped a lot sooner than it was because his corner was constantly getting in his head. So that is one of the things from a fan perspective, like you kind of get used to it. And what's really interesting is you could literally hear the punches. Like when Justin Gaethje in a recent title fight was fighting Tony Ferguson, we were all in just amazement at how hard those shots were landing on Tony Ferguson and how long he was actually able to take it before the fight got stopped late. So you can hear the punches, the kicks, and that's all very interesting. And again, the fighter perspective is more that you can hear your corner a lot clearer.
I know you talked about Green taking the fight on short notice. I did a little bit of research before this. Again, I know nothing, but from what I saw, apparently a lot of these guys collectively are taking fights on short notice. Are any that stand out where there's an advantage to be gained, or like how do you take that information and apply it to making lineups?
Well, see, there's short notice and then there's short notice. Like shorter notice, like a typical fight camp, people are going to tell you it's like from 6 to 8 weeks. A lot of the fighters on this slate have been rescheduled from other fight slates that were canceled due to COVID. So you do have a number of fighters that were at least in training, as opposed to Green, who hasn't had a fight in 2 years. And again, he's only 27, so that is not horrific. He's 6 years younger than Daniel Rodriguez. Hasn't had a fight in 2 years. I don't have any narrative at this point, and maybe more will develop as the week goes on, about whether he was training for a fight or not. I mean, hopefully, for his sake, I hope he was at least in training as opposed to training for a fight. So, yeah, the camps are shorter, but at least a lot of these are fighters that are in the UFC network and have been assigned fights at other slates, and they're being moved over to this slate.
Correlation, as far as correlation in fights, the last round, the featured fight, I believe, goes 5 rounds as opposed to the traditional 3 rounds. I suppose it matters who was fighting. This would be Burns and Woodley.
Yes.
So how do we have to have somebody in that fight? Do we sometimes play them both? If they just like brawl for 5 rounds, they can rack up enough points. And how do we, I guess it's specific to the fight, it's specific to the techniques and how these guys actually fight, how many punches they're going to throw, if they're just going to kind of chill for 5 rounds. How are we attacking the featured bout?
Well, I don't know who is better at throwing me softballs, Dan or yourself. I really appreciate that question because that's a softball for me. So what you're referring to in the main event is stacking, right? And there are people who will tell you, especially if you are a cash player, that you should always stack the main event. I am not in that camp. I believe there are fights that you should stack for the very reason that you illuminated. There's going to be a lot of activity, and you have to understand how scoring is in DraftKings too. I mean, if you have 2 stand-up fighters, meaning their MO is to strike and not to look for takedowns, not to look for, not wrestlers, strikers. You need those extra rounds to get enough significant strikes to make it worthwhile to hit value. A decision win is 30 points. You get every 2 significant strikes result in 1 point. So obviously those 2 additional rounds, assuming that you keep up a constant rate of activity, is better for scoring. Now, in terms of stacking, you want 2 relatively high volume strikers. You don't necessarily have that here. I mean, Tyrone Woodley is notoriously a low volume striker. And Gabriel Burns, at least recently, is more of a finisher. So I suspect that this fight will not go 5 rounds. I have not looked yet or recently at what the inside the distance prop is. I don't see this as a great fight to stack. And I would even go so far as to say if there may be better value on the rest of the slate. Now, of course, with only 11 fights, and generally you have between 11 and 13, the more fights, the better for variance and for spreading. With 11 fights, you're probably going to want some exposure to the main event, but I don't necessarily see it as a must because both of these fighters tend to score well in a finish. What you really don't want is a hug fest and then, a later finish, because the way that scoring works is the earlier the finish, the more points you get. So, and that's certainly possible. It's certainly possible that one of these fighters can get an early finish. The other thing to factor in is the cage is smaller for this event than typical UFC events. They're fighting at the UFC Annex in Las Vegas, which is where they do, the Dana White Contender Series fights. So it's a smaller cage. And that kind of will factor into guys that are strikers that like to fight in a phone booth, that aren't kind of movement guys like a Dominic Cruz who likes to kind of use the entire octagon when he moves. So there's that to take into consideration. But I would say it is okay to put a few lineups in, even if you're doing 20, that do not include the main event.
For what it's worth, Woodley versus Burns, to go the distance, it's plus 140 on DK, minus 190 no.
Yeah.
Does that sound about right to you? As far as
I mean, again, simply because they're both low, that Woodley in particular is a low output striker. I mean, I would expect maybe even in a normal 5-round fight where you have, especially for a title, you might have in a men's fight numbers that are even wider than that. But I think 190, about 2-1 is probably right, that the fight doesn't go the distance. I would be very surprised if this went the full 5 rounds based on both on Burns and Woodley's track record of fights. I would expect a finish. So I think it's important that you get the right side here and not try to stack it and in cash and come up with those few extra points that you're going to get for a stack. Because I could see an early finish here.
Yeah, I guess it's two different brains. I should have clarified as far as like a tournament perspective and a cash game perspective. And I think you're more likely to roster one in a cash as opposed to tournament. Like tournament, you can do whatever you want. That's what I'm told. And yeah.
Well, actually, Dean, it's the opposite. Most people like to stack in cash. Like it's inadvisable to stack in a tournament because you're already starting the day with 1 loss. So you're starting the slate with now. Not to say there have been instances in the past when the stack actually wound up on the optimal. Now it does occur, but it's very unusual. And it's usually guys that are really high volume strikers that do go the distance. That you have and more common in women's fights. Like when Joanna Jędrzejczyk, who fights at 115 in the women's division, she is a high velocity and high volume striker, but is not really a finisher per se. So like if she gets in with another striker, I mean, she could throw 200 significant strikes in a fight. And even if she loses, right, you're going to get 100 points. For that. So you really are more apt. People are more apt to stack in cash, but there are occasions where it makes sense.
Was that the woman who fought recently? I know there was like a legendary...
where her head blew up into where she looked like Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah,
that was Joanna, and that was a very close decision against the Chinese champion, Wai Li. Very good fight. Like people calling it an early fight of the year candidate, but that was a fight where both women scored significantly well because no one got finished. And it was a slugfest.
So you mentioned the scoring system, and this is kind of one of the reasons why I'm a little hesitant to play a lot of MMA because it's a little scary, a little intimidating. And so a first-round knockout, you get extra points for being in the first round. Ideally, I suppose, is a knockout in like the last 3 or 4 or 5 seconds of the first round where you collect all those points leading up to the knockdown. But theoretically, could you score more points if you knock somebody out in the second or third round if you're racking up enough punches?
Absolutely, especially if you have a wrestling aspect to your game because you're also getting 5 points for takedowns. You're getting points for improving your position. You're getting points for reversals and advances. Advances meaning improving your position. And to your point, significant strikes. You get 90 points for a first round finish by either knockout or sub. You get 70 points for a second round finish. So in theory, if you were to finish if you were to get a finish at the end of the second round and you've landed a takedown or two, maybe a few advances, and you racked up more significant strikes, you can certainly score more than if you got an early first-round finish. And that's one of the strategies when you're looking at guys like Francis Ngannou, referred to as Frankie Murder, who is a heavyweight fighter who has really quick finishes. And if he's priced really highly and he gets a quick finish, your ceiling is very limited. You get 90 points, you get a knockdown, which is 10 points, and then you get whatever significant strikes he threw to get that finish. So, you definitely have your floor is nice, but if he's really priced high, he might not be on the optimal, even though he gets a first-round finish.
It's just so weird to me to get my mind around the concept of if your dude knocks out the other dude in the first 5 seconds, that might be almost a bad thing in some ways, which is just sort of weird to me.
Well, DraftKings, Dean, did change a while back the scoring. It used to be you'd get 100 points for the first round finish.
Yeah.
And they changed the scoring to assist fighters who are wrestling based. Mm-hmm. You get a lot more. There's a lot more scoring now for takedowns and reversals and advancing and improving your position. And as a result, they changed it from 100 points for a first round finish to 90.
All right, let's dive in. Let's talk about some of the fights. Let's talk about some of the fighters that are standing out to you from a DK perspective. Is there a building block? Is there somebody? Would you hit a lock button? You wouldn't hit a lock button on 150 lineups, I don't think. Not in MMA or
no. I mean,
on the fight.
Yeah, obviously Rodriguez, that fight is going to be highly targeted simply because you have a 7.3K fighter that's minus 335. So there's going to be a lot of ownership there. I think we kind of talked through that. There was also a heavyweight fight between Augusto Sakai and Blagovoy Ivanov. That where they're pretty much equal. I mean, they're both like minus 110, minus 112.
Mm-hmm.
The thought being that, that fight is likely going to end in a finish, and they are lower to mid-tier heavyweights, which are typically good fights to target because generally someone's going to get finished. And you look at the finish prop, in that fight. I mean, I have a lean. I don't have a strong opinion on that fight. I have a lean towards Augusto Sakai, but it's not a strong lean. Another fight to look at is at the complete other end of the spectrum, 125-pound fight. You have Tim Elliott. You have Tim Elliott fighting Casey Kenny, right? And then you have one weight class up, Luis Smoka. You have Luis Smoka fighting Casey Kenny, and you have Tim Elliott fighting a guy named Royale. Luis Smoka and Casey Kenny, there are going to be a lot of grappling-based points in that fight. So that could be a good fight to target. Smoka might actually offer some value. He was a party to the highest scoring fight in the history of MMA for two fighters, where the stack yielded, close to 300 points. If you were to stack the fight, like Tim Elliott scored 175 points. And he's also fighting on this slate, which actually momentarily confused me. But that's an interesting fight to target. The fights I would probably avoid for DraftKings is I would avoid the female fight between Antonio Shevchenko, and if that name sounds familiar, she is Valentina's little older sister, actually, much less skilled, who's fighting a fighter that they call the blonde fighter, Chukagian from New Jersey, who actually is coming off of a loss to the sister, Valentina. That doesn't happen too often.
There's got to be some narrative to street there, right?
All right. Oh, yeah. That is interesting. Now, this is an interesting fight because, Antonia is a much less experienced fighter than Chukagian. Also, Chukagian does have a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under Renzo Gracie, which is a well-thought-of belt to have. Now, she's not typically a takedown fighter, but Antonia's weakness is on the ground. That fight has a massive inside the distance value prop. So I would take a stab at maybe Chukagian getting a finish in that fight, likely by submission. The reason why the line is so wide is because she typically does not go for takedowns. She's seen as a striker, but she does have a clear advantage on the ground, and she does come from a very good camp. So I could certainly see her working that into her game. And if she gets the finish, it's a huge payday. I don't like it on DraftKings because I think it's probably going to end in decision. And it's going to be kind of a boring striking affair. But I also see some value just betting on Chukagian at plus money, being the more experienced fighter, having a better pedigree. And there's some recency bias, partially because of her loss to the younger sister, and partially because of the name Shevchenko. I do kind of see some value in playing as a bet Chukagian at plus money.
Yeah, she's a slight dog here in the DK Sportsbook, currently at plus 115. Welcome back just for a second as far as the Augusto Sakai versus Ivanov matchup. They're both minus 112. Like you said, DK is telling us it's a coin toss. You're telling me that there's a really good chance one of these dudes is going to knock out one of the other dudes. So when you're building a bunch of lineups, when you're on your model, do you say, hey, I don't want both these guys, but I want to have one of these guys, and you can say, hey, give me one and maybe make it 55% one, 45% the other. Is there ever a time, and is this a potential time where you say, I want to lock in whoever dominates this fight?
Well, I mean, again, in a lower level heavyweight fight that unless you particularly have some insight that the line is off, which I don't necessarily have. I do have a lean to Sakai, but it's a slight lean. I probably want to have a fair amount or an equally weighted amount of each fighter in mass entry. Now, if you're not playing mass entry, if you're only going to play a handful of lineups, I mean, I think if you play 3 lineups, maybe you do 1, and none, in 3 lineups. But, it's hard to take a stand in a lower level heavyweight fight. I mean, yeah, the upside is there for the finish, but the floor isn't very high, and you really don't want to start out the night with a fight, or not start out the night, but have a fighter in your lineup with 5 points or 7 points or 10 points because that fighter happened to get starched quickly.
Then you're done. Like you can't recover from that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, and that's the hardest part about mass entry is, you know, and I counsel people on this. You're knowingly putting lineups, and you know this from playing other sports. You're knowingly putting lineups in that are destined to fail, and you're doing that as a partial hedge, because you want to spread the variance and you want exposure, right? So that's the hardest thing for a lot of people to grasp. Like, why don't I just, you know, go out on an island? Which is great if you're right, but if you're wrong, I mean, it makes the night really long.
Dern is the most expensive fighter at 9,300. She's minus 400 according to the Vegas line. And this also kind of leads to a question I have. I heard again in my little research I did. They were talking about how the UFC just wants Dern to win, like for whatever reason. Like she's like the future, and the woman she's fighting against apparently is just not that significant according to their future considerations. And, you know, I see people on Twitter talking about all the time, like, that was a terrible judge, that was a terrible judgment, and there's all sorts of sketchy judgments out there. How much do you consider, like, well, how would this best benefit the UFC? And maybe it breaks a tie, or like this person's more likely to win and kind of get graded on a curve. How much does that factor in? And Dern specifically, is she worth the most expensive price tag here on DK?
Okay, so a quick confession I have to make. I'm not sure how I got this name, but I am referred to as the Chick Whisperer for my. I like to watch women's fights. I watch Invicta a lot. I mean, I scout women, you know, for fighting, and also the King of Narrative. So when you combine those two together, there are fighters within the UFC who get who get more runway than other fighters. Generally, those are the lookers that the UFC wants to get behind marketing. Now, Mckenzie Dern is both Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu royalty and is not overly hard on the eyes, if you followed her on Instagram. She is coming off a loss. Her loss was her first fight post-childbirth. And it was a really, really difficult fight against a fighter who I see as a top 5, maybe even a top 3 fighter in the weight class. So this is what I refer to as a give me fight for Mckenzie Dern. Now, anything could happen in MMA, and if, you know, Dern has got such an advantage on the ground, the fighter she's fighting is coming from a finished loss. She's tough. Cyphers is tough. But really, this is one of those where the matchmaker is saying, Mckenzie Dern, we gave you a tough fight your first fight post childbirth. We're going to give you Hannah Cyphers. And if you can't get something done here, it's kind of back to the drawing board. So is she worth minus 400? Probably not. However, you know, she is going to be targeted because there's that potential for ground points. You know, she is going to look to get the fight to the ground. She is going to look to lock up a submission. She is going to get advances. Cyphers is tough as they come. But, you know, if this fight starts to go long, if this fight gets out of the second round, it could get very interesting where, you know, your theory or your, you know, what you were talking about in terms of a close decision coming into play. And one thing that needs to be made very clear, the UFC does not control who judges the fights. It's all done by the commission in the state that the fights are being held. So obviously, the greater level of frequency that a fight card is held in a state, typically the more competent the judging is. Like, we had some real issues with Florida in the past couple of weeks. There were some really strange decisions, especially on the last slate. Las Vegas, on the other hand, should have a higher level of competency in the judges because there are a lot more fights, MMA fights in Las Vegas.
You were talking about like King of Narratives. I can't help but notice in these times, the current living situation we're in, how do you not lock button Quarantillo? How is that? I don't know. And he's a favorite too. I don't know anything about him. Never heard of him. Billy Quarantillo. Is he interesting to you? I don't. Is that?
Yeah. Look, I mean, he actually scored 139 points, I believe, in his last DraftKings in his one and only fight that he had in the UFC. It's interesting because he's going up against a fighter known as Spike Carlyle, known as the Alpha Ginger. He's a redheaded fighter who was an underdog in his last fight and did actually pretty well. I mean, it's a closely lined fight. I've seen support for both fighters. I do suspect it's going to end in either a finish or, kind of a bloody type of decision because both these guys especially Carlyle, tends to get after it. Cardio definitely comes into play. You kind of touched on reduced training camps earlier in the show. And cardio does come into play. A lot of these guys look to get a finish early, and they're perfectly willing to kind of finish or be finished, in order to get the fight over with early and, worry about their cardio if the fight goes into the third round. So I'm kind of expecting a finish in this fight. And honestly, I think this is a pretty good fight to target.
Give me somebody that's probably going to win, but maybe their DK price is too expensive or just not going to rack up enough points. So somebody you think is going to win, but still probably is worth having less than the field.
Yeah, I mean, I would say probably the second highest priced fighter, Roosevelt Roberts. I can take a quick look on I don't think he's actually scored that well from a DraftKings perspective in his past several fights. And, he is a pretty significant favorite. So that might be a fight that you want less of considering the price point. That's one that comes to mind. Also, you probably don't want a lot of either side of the women's fight unless you're looking at it as a contrarian opportunity. Like if you truly follow my line of thought and feel that Chookagian is going to get the fight to the ground despite the fact that she has not gone for a takedown previously, then that could be a good contrarian play, and her price point is pretty attractive. I don't see a really high ceiling on Antonia. Even if she wins, I'd be very surprised if she got a finish. Going back, looking at Roosevelt Roberts, his last fight, he won by decision and only scored 53 points at 8.5K. Prior to that, he lost. He was at 8.9K and only scored 32 points. And then prior to that, he was at 9.5K and only scored 85 points. So in his last three fights, 2 wins and a loss, he did not approach that 10X mark. And again, we look at X in MMA in a similar fashion as you would in the other main sports. The benchmark is kind of 10X for cash, and then 12X or higher for GPPs is what you're looking for.
And inversely, give me somebody that pops from a DK price perspective as far as the best value, the best play outside of Rodriguez. We already talked about Rodriguez, who we gave the reasons as to why his price is what it is based upon his fight now. Things have changed. 7.3K, I'd imagine they'll be in every single cash game lineup. But give me somebody that's maybe you'll be taking a stand on, somebody, I don't know, 8.3, 8.2 and under that is really popping for you.
Well, I mean, obviously, you have the heavyweight fight, but I'll go deeper than that because that's pretty much Captain Obvious is you want to target the heavyweight fight, which is pretty even. I think there could be potentially some value in Luis Smolka. I think he could have it unless, and I don't see it necessarily happening, but unless he gets submitted really quickly, which has happened in the past, I can certainly see him having a decent floor, vis-a-vis his grappling. I do expect a lot of this fight to happen on the ground. And both fighters are ground fighters based on their pedigree. So I could certainly see there being some value at a really low price point for Luis Smolka. Now, on the other side, if you want to play the dog with the potential to get a finish, I'm certainly Spike Carlyle, the Alpha Ginger. I am seeing some love for the Alpha Ginger, and he is attractively priced as well. But these guys are both GPPs. Like, unfortunately, the lock and load play in cash is going to be right or wrong. Rodriguez, I can see a lot of people at 7.3 plugging him in to not only their cash games, but also I could see him being very highly owned in GPPs, which in a sense could be good because the ownership on some of these other guys that I mentioned, like Smolka and Spike Carlyle, might be lower than you would normally expect. If Kevin Holland was in that fight, you would have seen very low ownership on Rodriguez.
So just a general thought or general question and kind of how you apply it to making lineups or picking fighters. Skill level in conjunction with variance, like a horse race, a maiden race versus like the Kentucky Derby. And now you jump over to MMA, like two guys that, somebody's got to win, right? And there's a decent chance they're going to slug it out and somebody's going to put up a lot of points. The mediocre skill level to variance as opposed to like the highest skill level versus variance. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. It does. I kind of see where you're coming from. So yeah, there are obviously fighters that step up in competition. And there are fighters that step down in competition. The matchmaking is sometimes questionable by the UFC. And you got to kind of read between the lines. Like, are they legitimately? And you have what's known as gatekeepers, like guys that you kind of want to keep around to test prospects that you want to tout. And the thought being, like, if a prospect can step up and beat this gatekeeper, then he's probably destined for better things. But if he stalls against the gatekeeper, then he probably needs to kind of rethink his strategy. So yeah, you do look at skills. More important than that, though, is matchups. Like, there are bad and good stylistic matchups for fighters. Like if you are a stand-up fighter with a bad takedown defense, no matter how skilled you might be at striking, it might not be the best stylistic matchup for you to go against a former D1 wrestler who's going to look to get the fight to the ground. Like the best example of that most people will know is Khabib Nurmagomedov against Conor McGregor. Now, Conor McGregor didn't have the worst takedown defense in the world, but Khabib is an elite wrestler. I mean, this is a guy who's wrestled bears in Russia. I mean, from the time he was 12 years old, and it's a huge wrestling culture. So Khabib was able to get the fight to the ground, and McGregor was essentially lost. So you want to look at stylistic matchups. On the inverse of that, Tony Ferguson versus Justin Gaethje, that was a good stylistic matchup for both fighters, because even though Gaethje had a D1 wrestling background in his pocket, and Tony Ferguson was proficient in jiu-jitsu, both of the fighters were very stand-up oriented. So for both fighters, they were going to take a striking-based offense in the game. Both were high-output strikers. And Gaethje actually historically absorbed more strikes than he threw, even though he threw quite a few strikes per minute. And that's kind of what everybody looks at. Everybody looks at strikes landed per minute and strikes absorbed per minute. Those are big, important metrics for those guys that actually do look at the math in MMA.
Yeah, it's interesting how the UFC has a certain level of manipulation where they can either set you up for failure or set you up for success.
Right.
All right, we're going to get a couple takes from you from the Vegas Sportsbook. Before we do that, let's knock out the DFS perspective here. Give me a fighter or two that maybe you're on higher than the field. Maybe a fighter or two that you feel like they're going to be on the GPP winning lineup. What do you have for me?
Okay, so on the GPP winning lineup, I don't know how much of a hot take this is, but I do think that Mckenzie Dern is going to get the finish. Now, she's got to get it early, but you are going to get grappling points. If it goes to a decision, it could be a bad play, and she's going to be very highly priced. I do think one of the two heavyweight fighters are going to be on the optimal, simply because I see that fight ending by finish. So
and those two are who again?
Those two are Augusta Sakai and Ivanov. I can see those fighters being on the optimal. Interesting to me is Casey Kenny, Luis Smoka, because again, that's a fight that's going to be settled likely on the ground, and the other fight that's likely going to be settled on the ground is the Tim Elliott fight. Tim Elliott is not a super big favorite. He's minus 190 against Brandon Royal, who is plus 150. I could certainly see that fight, playing out predominantly on the ground. And Elliott has put up huge numbers in the past. I told you, I mean, he is one of the highest scorers ever on DraftKings at 175. And I could certainly see him replicating that. So given that he is more attractively priced than Mckenzie Dern, I would probably have more of that fight, on my, in my lineups. I'd probably look to put Tim Elliott in a fair amount of lineups. I'm not sure what ownership is going to be yet. It's a little early to kind of forecast ownership, but yeah, I'm not going to say he's going to be overlooked, but I do think that I'm going to have significant exposure to Tim Elliott.
All right, let's pivot over to the DK Sportsbook. I know you mentioned Mckenzie Dern. She's minus 400. I don't know if you want to lay that juice. If you think it's a good favorite to kind of hammer because you think it's a pretty solid wager, or somebody else on the board that'd be your favorite bet when you consider the odds over there at DK.
I would look at the sub prop on Mckenzie Dern. I'm not sure that they're out yet. I have a feeling that she's going to win by sub. It's possible that she wins by ground and pound. So I would kind of look at, usually there's two props out there on DraftKings, where one is where you could actually pick the precise method of finish, be it KO or be it sub. Another is by any finish. I would kind of look at the spread between those two. And if there's not that wide a variance between wins by any finish and wins by submission, I would kind of just go the wins by any finish, because I do suspect that Mckenzie Dern is going to get the finish. Likely by sub, but possibly by ground and pound. I could see either one of those happening. I would not lay minus 400. I did mention Chukagian. She's been as high as plus 120. I'd watch the line movement on that. I already have a bet down personally on Chukagian. I will take a small flyer on both inside the distance and take a look at what that submission prop opens up as. Just on Chukagian, just because I think there is a possibility that she will, even though she hasn't in the past, get the fight to the ground and perhaps finish Antonia by sub. So I will take a small flyer on that, but that is a high-risk proposition. I feel a lot more comfortable about just betting on Chukagian to win at plus money. I do kind of like that.
I just pulled it up on the fly, by the way. To win by any knockout, submission, or DQ, Mckenzie Dern jumps from minus 400 to minus 152. Is that good enough for you?
Yeah, I would probably take a flyer at that. Again, not to say she can't win an ugly decision, but I have to believe that if Mckenzie Dern gets position on the ground, she's either going to choke her out or get such an advantageous position that she's going to ground and pound Cyphers to the extent that either Cyphers, quits or the referee stops the fight. Now, there is that chance that it goes to kind of this ugly type of decision. We've seen that before with Mckenzie Dern, and Cyphers is tough. But Cyphers did get finished in her last fight. So I could certainly see that happening by Mckenzie Dern. And I do think the UFC is sort of lobbing her a softball here.
All right, let's get you out of here on this one. I don't know if this is a softball or not, but your favorite live dog in the DK Sportsbook.
Wow. Okay, so my favorite dog.
Talk me through it. What do you have?
Yeah, okay. So, I'm going to go, and this is a dog by virtue of the fact that he's plus money. Yeah. I'm going to say Spike Carlisle, the Alfred Ginger. You're getting plus money. If you want a real deep dog, I would take a flyer on Gabriel Green. There are a lot of unknowns, but you've got a 33-year-old journeyman who was brought in to lose against Tim Means, who actually earned more in that fight with his performance of the night bonus than he's earned in his entire career in mixed martial arts. Now, you want narrative? Like all of a sudden you have $50,000, $75,000 in your pocket, where you've never made any money in MMA. There's sort of a glow that's going to fade there. So if you want to take a shot at plus money, that is a real high-profile flyer. If you want something that's perhaps a bit more realistic with less question marks and less narrative, I would certainly look at Spike Carlisle.
Joe, where can people find you? Where can they hit you up if they have any extra questions as far as MMA? I know you're Suntzu on the Twitter machine. Put any plugs out there you want. So
I am at Suntzu on Twitter. That's S as in Sam, UNTSZU on Twitter. I do troll Twitter a lot. I'm generally pretty free with my time, answering intelligent questions. I do a periodic show with the infamous Pred Apley called Creating Alpha in Daily Fantasy MMA that we kind of have going on. That's a loosely formatted show. It's not a selection video. I'm excited to be working with you guys on occasion.
Yeah, I much appreciate it. I feel like I learned a lot. Now I'm going to fire. I'm going to make a couple of lineups. And if I'm going to troll you on Twitter if I lose, it's all your fault. But if I win, I will make sure to take that victory lap. Like, look at my screenshot. This is all me.
And save some powder, Dean, for the Millie Maker. Like, those of us who are hardcore MMA players since 2015, we always felt like we were the redheaded stepchild of MMA of sports, because we never got really a live final. And these contests that we have, these bracket challenge contests kind of just extend forever. And now we find ourselves with a contest where $1 million goes to first place. So, be sure to fire up into that.
That was Joe Suntzu at Suntzu on the Twitter machine. Much appreciated. Thank you guys for listening to the Morning Grind. I was Dean. We're out of here. Holler.